This video was brought to you by the wonderful people on screen here who support me over at Patreon. If you want to support this channel and what I do, then please check the link in the description or the link at the end of the video. What's up guys? Today's going to be another one of those more different videos, so I hope you'll enjoy. Today we're going to be going over the personal epistemology of Darth Bane. In short, epistemology is just your personal theory of knowledge. It's a lens through which you view the world in order to determine what's true. Let's go ahead and start the intro. Alright everybody, as per usual, let's go ahead and get right into the fan art and then get into the video proper. First, in keeping with theme, we have this Darth Vader Suris from Kitty, then we have a power-armored cyborg Suris from Sci-Fi, and finally we have me meeting Three-Eyed Cat for the first time by, well, Three-Eyed Cat. Alrighty, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into things.
Do you know who I am?
Yes, Darth Bane, the ancient Sith Lord you are.
And know why I am not forgotten?
Created the rule of two, you did.
The Sith killed each other, victims of their own greed. But from the ashes of destruction, I was the last survivor. I chose to pass my knowledge on to only one. I created a legacy so resilient that now you come before me.
So I wanted to tackle Darth Bane's philosophy because it, like my own, is a pragmatic one. So the first thing we have to do is get into what pragmatism is. Now, there are a few different schools of thought on pragmatism. This is mainly due to the fact that it was born out of 3 different philosophers in America disagreeing with one another constantly, but the full history is a video for another day. Suffice to say, pragmatism's job is not to discover objective reality, or what's ontologically true. It is also not meant to interpret subjective meanings behind things either. No, the goal of pragmatism is very simple, to generate useful knowledge for practice. So knowledge would not be an end goal, knowledge would be a tool that must be used towards a greater goal. If something that you are doing does not work towards some type of greater goal, then it is not useful, and therefore must be discarded. So while all epistemology is an attempt to figure out what is true about the world, through a pragmatic lens, it is the relation between knowledge and the action that that knowledge can lead to that is the ultimate truth. And that is a very brief explanation of things. There's a lot more I can get into, but I don't want this video to get terribly long, so let's move to Darth Bane. So, a bit of his history. For those who enjoy the Star Wars series, Darth Bane is a character who existed about 1,000 years before Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. Anyone who's played old Star Wars video games or read many of the old novels will know that there was a time where the Sith numbered in the thousands, much like the Jedi. Whereas in the films, we're told that there's a rule of 2 that Sith must comport to. This is why throughout the episodes we have Maul Insidious, Tyrannus Insidious, and finally Vader Insidious. And when it comes time for Darth Sidious to get a new apprentice, in Episode 6 we see that it is through the action of an attempt to discard Vader. Now there is some discussion over whether or not the rule of 2 was still in effect at this time, but that, again, is another discussion for another day. I'll be doing another video on Darth Plagueis in order to get into that information. But how did these 2 realities exist in the same universe? Why were there once thousands of Sith, and then only 2? And for that matter, to what end? Well, in short, that's because that was what was most useful. The Sith have a history of infighting and betrayal, so the most useful way to consolidate power and conduct themselves ultimately ended up being consolidating everything into 2 people, making sure that all the wealth, knowledge, power, and wherewithal to action were all focused into a single individual and their apprentice. And when the single individual, the master, was no longer useful to the apprentice, the master needed to be discarded. And thus the search for a new apprentice would begin for the old apprentice, now master. The way that this came about, though, was an incredibly bloody and catastrophic ordeal, so let's go ahead and get into the history behind Darth Bane. Darth Bane was born as Dez, and he was a poor child on a mining world. He was shouldered with his father's crippling debt, and after his father's death, he ultimately had to take care of that himself. But instead of being able to take care of that debt, he ultimately found himself in a series of circumstances that led to him being recruited into the Sith army. At this time, the Sith had armies of foot soldiers who weren't force sensitive, so don't think about a whole bunch of people with lightsabers. These are your standard troops. It was discovered through his actions on the battlefield that Dez might actually be force sensitive and was thus brought into the inner circle of the Dark Lords. By this time, the Sith had determined that what was best for them was to discard the Darth title. because according to the Sith Order at the time, any Sith taking the name of Darth, such as Darth Vader, put a giant target on their back for both their enemies and their would-be allies who would like a quick rise to power. Des, upon entering the Academy and understanding this new philosophy for the Sith, took the name Darth Bane. It was through his studies of many of the old Sith Lords, though, that he decided that this tact wasn't the most useful for the Sith going forward. If anything, removing the Darth title and acting more like a congregation and a military made them closer resemble what the Jedi were, and that wasn't terribly useful, because the Jedi gain power when their numbers swell, but the Sith end up cutting themselves down when their numbers swell. So in his mind, what was ultimately most useful for the Sith was to consolidate power. So Darth Bane enacted a plan that ultimately led to all of the Sith in a war with the Jedi being wiped out, all except for himself. I don't want to go into specifics, I would like you guys to read the books for yourselves, but suffice to say he tricked all of the Sith that existed at that time into channeling their power into what essentially was a force-powered nuclear bomb. With all the Sith wiped out, Bane claimed the title of Darth, and became what, as far as he knew, was the only Sith left in the galaxy. He had discovered from studying old philosophers such as Darth Revan that having two Sith was the best way to go about things. As he would say later, one master to embody the power and one apprentice to crave it. The apprentice needed to crave the power of the master because that was a useful motivating factor, and the master must be able to wield ultimate power with authority because, again, that is what is most useful to the Sith Order in being able to influence the galaxy. Up until Bane, history had shown throughout the galaxy that the Sith would try to take over planets by force, and there was at least one bit of truth in what his old teachers had told him: the Darth title did put a target on your back. So ultimately, he found that what was most useful was to try to control the galaxy from the shadows, utilizing a series of mercenaries and middlemen that he gained access to by accessing the financial accounts of all the Sith Lords whom he had killed. This consolidated the power, wealth, and knowledge of thousands of Sith into a single person. He also discovered a small 10-year-old child named Rain on the planet after killing all of the Sith. This child would become his apprentice, and his method of training was brutal. Pragmatism itself can be a pretty cold-blooded philosophy, and it shows in his treatment of Rain. The very first thing he did after showing her the death and destruction that he had wrought amongst the previous Sith, essentially as a warning not to repeat their mistakes, was to abandon her and tell her that she needed to rendezvous with him on another planet. If she was worthy of becoming a Sith Master like he was, then she would find a way to do it on her own. In reality, this was only half true. Again, with pragmatism being a philosophy of applied knowledge to action, Darth Bane used the time that his apprentice was trying to rendezvous with him on another planet in order to go seek out more knowledge to help further the Sith cause, what was now ultimately his cause, thanks to his new rule of two. Ultimately, he acquired some of the information that he sought and attempted to rendezvous with his apprentice on a new planet. Rain, however, found herself completely surrounded on the planet she was supposed to rendezvous with Bane on due to crash landing her ship that she had hijacked from a group of locals. Darth Bane rescued her, showing her his second example of the power of the Force. The first demonstration had obviously been the remnants of the bomb on the previous planet. This struck Rain with awe, and she asked if one day she would be able to wield power like that as well, and this is where Bane's pragmatic philosophy comes to blossom again. The first thing he told her was that power is only a means to an end, not an end unto itself. Power is completely useless unless you can utilize it for a particular action, and even then, that action must serve another goal. There are also many points in time where Rain inquires why Bane doesn't simply kill certain people, and he uses all of these instances to give her a lesson on cost-benefit analysis. The catharsis of killing people is not equivalent to the benefit of keeping them alive. So any time that Bane has a secret informant, or encounters a mercenary whom he wants to spin a tale, he lets them live so that there can be some wisps of truth for the Jedi to run after. Letting the galaxy become too quiet will mean that the very minute that Bane or any Sith revealed themselves would be the exact moment that the Jedi would pounce on them. However, if the Jedi are busy for hundreds of years, chasing tales from mercenaries and half-truths from business advisors, it would make it much easier for Bane and any other Sith to operate in secrecy. After all, if he was spotted on another planet, wouldn't that just be one more tall tale, as opposed to the only mention of a Sith on a distant planet? In fact, this is an instance that happens, and it's one of the reasons why Bane decides that allowing these half-truths is a good idea. The minute that information gets to the Jedi that one Sith Lord still lives is the time that several Jedi come and try to attack Bane and his apprentice on Tython. So ultimately, hiding behind half-truths is much more useful than trying to veil yourself in complete anonymity. We can see how practically every action that Bane takes dials back to pragmatism, and a very ruthless form of it at that. Also, in teaching his apprentice to be pragmatic and think as he does, he tasks her with training a wild animal. She is to find a feral animal and tame it, and her next lessons can only begin once the animal has been tamed. This is to teach his apprentice patience, but like in the previous instance of telling his apprentice that rendezvousing with him on another planet would show that she was worthy of being a Sith Lord, this too had another purpose. Rain ultimately tames the animal and brings it to Bane, showing that she has learned the lesson of patience. Bane immediately snaps the animal's neck and then tells her to toss it in a stew. The second lesson that was to be learned here was not only one of patience, but that once you have achieved your goal, you must discard those things that are no longer useful to you. The animal in this instance had completely served its purpose as a training tool for her, and now must serve another purpose in order to maintain being useful. That purpose, of course, being meat in a pot for them to eat and sustain themselves. This is a lesson that would be echoed later whenever Rain develops an interest in a young Twi'lek and begins falling in love and even becoming sexual partners with him. However, the Twi'lek in question was a political activist, and he desperately wanted to overthrow the Republic that Bane was seeking to control from the shadows. If he was successful in overthrowing the Republic in even a small sense, fragmenting it would make it harder to control. So ultimately, the only use that this person could serve was to die in order to give the Republic another thing to do instead of trying to tail Darth Bane. Xana is ordered to lead the Twi'lek and his compatriots on a mission that will ultimately end in failure, so that the Republic can still stand and Bane can deal with only one enemy instead of a fragmented 1,000 across the galaxy. Really no different than snapping the animal's neck and tossing it in the stew. Again, everything dials back to what is most useful. There are many times throughout the trilogy of books revolving around Darth Bane that he notes that there are several people he's encountered that deserve death, and that for some of these people the galaxy would even be a better place if these people were to stop existing, but that keeping them around was ultimately much more useful than discarding them, no matter how much of a bad taste it put in his mouth. Pragmatism leads to an end goal, whereas killing them would be simple catharsis. Ultimately, by the time we get to the third book, Bane is unsure as to whether or not his apprentice will actually try to take the seat from him. The apprentice has to kill the master and prove that they are better and thus worthy of the throne in his new Sith Order. But because he's starting to become old and frail, he thinks that his apprentice Rain, now Darth Xana, is going to simply wait until he's too feeble to fight back and then take the throne by default. The whole purpose of him forming the new Rule of Two was that it was more useful to consolidate power in the Sith. But if a Sith were to gain the throne by default, this would no longer be a consolidation of power. This would be allowing some of the more powerful in the Order to wither, and thus leave the Order with a weaker whole. So even though it violates the Rule of Two, Darth Bane seeks out the secrets to immortality. This is because, again, as with everything in pragmatic philosophy, it was most useful to maintain the Sith Order's power, to try to maintain his seat for as long as possible until a worthy apprentice would take over. Ultimately, Bane succeeds in discovering the secret to immortality, but finds that it comes at a very great sacrifice, one that he really doesn't have the time to deal with. You see, there are two ways to gain immortality in the Star Wars universe. One is to essentially sacrifice an entire planet in a dark side ritual, a method that Bane did not discover, but was important for another emperor earlier on in the timeline. Or the method that he did discover, essence transfer. Through essence transfer, he could basically supplant his consciousness into any being. The downside of this, though, was that the being could only hold one consciousness at a time, so he would have to have more willpower than the person he was trying to supplant. If not, his consciousness would be cast into the void, a fate worse than death, essentially. But since at this point in time he really only has another 2 to 5 years to live, he doesn't have much of a choice. The only other option would be putting his consciousness into a clone body, but again, that would require time that he simply didn't have. After discovering this, though, Bane gets kidnapped and locked in a cell. You see, earlier on in the story, when there were still many Sith around, one of the Sith that he had become attached to actually betrayed him and poisoned him. Being unable to fight off the poison on his own, he seeks the aid of a healer. He threatens the healer's daughter in order to gain access to the healer's abilities and cure himself. He keeps the healer alive, however, because it is more useful to keep somebody alive who can bring you from a brink of death than it is to kill them for simply knowing who you are. 10 years later, Darth Xana ultimately ends up killing this healer in order to protect Bane. The only reason Bane does not retaliate on Xana for doing so was that he understands that there was more usefulness in his death compared to the risks of keeping him alive at this point. After all, at this point in the story, the healer's daughter had already grown up and had left the planet that the healer resided on. Bane no longer had power over this healer. Unfortunately, the healer's daughter does end up kidnapping him, like I said, and injects him with various chemicals of torture in order to get him to admit to his crimes and say that he's sorry for the things that he's done. However, the only thing that ultimately happens is Bane giving her a lesson in cruel pragmatism. He remarks how there was no use in killing the father immediately, but then his death became a useful mechanism later down the road, and that was the reason why the torturing and the death happened to the father in the first place. It only ever happened because it was a means to an end. There was no point where Bane wanted the healer dead, so long as he was useful. This enrages the healer's daughter because instead of admitting that the things that he had done were wrong, he just stands by his epistemology of what is most useful to the Sith Order and to himself. This also demonstrates that above everything, Darth Bane was consistent in his stance. Even when being tortured, he was completely unwavering. This isn't to give him virtue points, this is just to show that he's consistent in his pragmatism. He practiced what he preached, and he made certain that those who questioned him on it would never do so again. Ultimately, he does break out of this cell and confronts his apprentice Darth Zana. Another lesson in ruthless pragmatism commences, and he lets her know that the reason he sought out immortality was because her actions led him to believe that under her rule the Sith Order would wither and die. Her waiting until he was older and more feeble to challenge him was ultimately, in his eyes, a sign of weakness, and not a sign of what would be most useful to the Order. He attempts the ritual of essence transfer on Zana throughout their battle, and ultimately fails. Bane falls, but the Sith Order live on through Zana. 1,000 years later, though, all of his machinations did lead to the Sith converting the Republic into an empire and gaining control. This, too, was also part of Bane's plan. There are several times throughout the books where he notes that even if he can't see the fall of the Jedi in his own time, it's less useful to the Sith Order for him to try to expedite the process when setting everything in motion is the most useful course of action. If the end goal is to see the Jedi fall, then whether or not he lives to see it doesn't serve a purpose. Like with before, catharsis doesn't necessarily factor into a cost-benefit analysis very well. The cost of pursuing the personal catharsis of watching the Jedi Order fall would not outweigh the benefit of having a well-laid-out plan, even if that plan took 1,000 years to fully execute. Darth Bane ultimately serves as the middle ground between the more rationalistic approach that the Jedi take to epistemology and the empiricist approach that the Sith do. And this actually holds true, since pragmatism is an attempt to reconcile the abstractness of rationalism with the particulars and nuance of empiricism. Pragmatism, ultimately at its core, is an understanding of truth as the success in guiding action and prediction. And we can see this echoed in how Darth Bane sets everything in motion in order to predict the fall of the Jedi 1,000 years later. It's truly a success in guiding action towards his prediction. But that was a brief overview of Darth Bane and his ruthless epistemology. But don't take my word for it. There are 3 books on it, and it's actually a really incredible series. So, if you enjoyed this breakdown of a fictional character's epistemology, please let me know in the comment section below, and let me know if there's another character you'd like to tackle next. I think that the next one I'm going to tackle is Darth Plagueis, but after that, practically anything is up for grabs. I don't know when I'm going to have time to get each of these particular episodes out. They do take longer to produce than my standard stuff, but if you enjoyed it, please let me know, and give me any feedback that you have. Also, remember to like the video, and share it with your friends if you enjoyed it. Subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon, and I will see you guys in the next one. As always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.